that puts a flash at once, and green means you're alive.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Have to be careful. Did they put a microphone on you? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think I'll stick mine in here. Yeah. Is it on? No, it shouldn't be on yet. Yeah, that's the button. Yeah, now it's on.
Yeah, this is on. Yeah.
No.
Well, a very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at the Stimson Center. I'm so pleased to welcome you all and grateful to you all for joining us this morning for the launch of this volume, edited by our own Samir Lalwani and Hannah Haegeland. You know, from the earliest days of this organization, we have focused on various aspects of reducing nuclear tensions around the world, and most notably, for reasons that may become apparent if you think about them long enough, in South Asia. Much of the work that has informed this volume really builds on a 30-year history that Stimson has. Much of that work was and continues to be spearheaded by our own co-founder, Michael Crapon, who unfortunately was not able to join us today, but his work and the work of the wider team that you are going to hear from this morning has certainly generated interest, not just in this town, but across the region, and perhaps now, as a result of this volume, in Beijing as well. I think it's no understatement to say that a full 2 decades after India and Pakistan tested their nuclear weapons, initially, South Asia, of course, remains, I think, one of the most conflict-prone regions of the world, with changing policy here in Washington, D.C. as a result of a new administration, with growing tensions in the region itself. This, I think, event comes at a regrettably fortuitous moment. And so over the course of the morning, you will hear from a distinguished group of panelists whom we have asked not just to recall previous instances of tension and conflict in the region, but to draw some lessons learned that might be applicable as we all wrestle with future policy in the region. And helping us do that, as I mentioned, is a most distinguished group of panelists that will include 2 former foreign secretaries, our former ambassador to India, experts from the U.S. intelligence community, and others in the policy community from the region and here in D.C. as well. We are also delighted to be joined by Congressman Bera from California, who will deliver our keynote address. We're very grateful to you. We understand there are a few other things that you and your colleagues are working on, and so it's a true delight to welcome you here to Stimson, and we're very grateful to you. And with that, and without further ado, I will turn this over to the man who is the Pied Piper of our event here this morning. He's really the visionary behind not just this event and this volume, but of our South Asia program. If you do not know Samir Lalwani, I will ask you, where have you been? You need to get to know Samir Lalwani. Samir serves, of course, as a senior associate here at Stimson, as well as the co-director of our South Asia program. Samir Lalwani.
All right, thank you, Brian. So thank you all for joining us. I just want to go through a few things quickly before I introduce Congressman Bera. So we're very pleased to launch this book. It's the fruit of a couple years of work investigating crises, South Asia's lessons, evolving dynamics and trajectories. And as Brian mentioned, the Stimson Center has long been involved in studying sort of the dynamics and the cadence of crises in South Asia over the last 3 decades in the effort to better inform policymakers in Washington, New Delhi, Islamabad, and Beijing. And so this book sort of continues in that tradition from the body of work that particularly Michael Crapon has led at the Stimson Center. The book's tried to answer 3 particular questions. This was the objective of the book. What have we as scholars and as parties to crises in the past learned from past crises? What are the stakes and new variables that are present? And what can we expect in the future? And for the answer to those questions, we encourage you to buy the book, but you don't actually have to buy it. You can get it for free. Here, pick up a copy. There's some outside. But an easier way for those of you tuning in online is to go to investigatingcrises.org. And there you can download the full PDF. You can download individual chapters. You can read it directly on your handheld device. None of you in the audience, though, I want you to make sure you're paying attention to the event. It's a very dynamic website that you can basically glean all the insights pretty quickly from the edited volume. I want to thank our partners who made this project and our efforts and our research possible, the MacArthur Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, and the National Nuclear Security Administration, who've all been sort of key supporters of our efforts for a long time, and we hope they continue to support these efforts so we can continue to produce research like this. A couple quick housekeeping bits. If you have a cell phone, which I'm sure many of you do, please turn the ringer off so we don't disrupt the panelists when we're making the presentations. If you happen to be tweeting today, use the hashtag #InvestigatingCrises so that everyone can catch on to your great insights. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Congressman Bera. I think the 2017 South Asia Strategy Review revealed that the U.S. still has high stakes in the region of South Asia. We obviously have thousands of troops deployed there in harm's way, with more on their way. It continues to be a nuclear flashpoint for the world. And it's also a critical note of this administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and the previous administration's efforts to bring geopolitical pluralism and balancing to the Asian continent. And if you consider tweets to be policy statements, then you could say one of the first policy statements that came out of the administration this year focused on the subcontinent. So I think we can expect this to be high on the agenda. And to reflect a little bit more on U.S. stakes and the Trump administration's policies towards India and Pakistan, we're joined by Congressman Bera, who's one of the foremost South Asia watchers on Capitol Hill. The Congressman represents California's 7th Congressional District. He's a vice-ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and is the longest-serving Indian American and South Asian American currently in Congress. Before being elected to Congress, he practiced medicine and served as Chief Medical Officer for Sacramento County. And drawing on his extensive medical background, Congressman Bera led efforts with the Foreign Affairs Committee to address the global Zika epidemic and is a strong supporter of American leadership and global health. He sits on the subcommittee on Asia and Pacific, which I think is one of the most important subcommittees, as well as the subcommittee on Africa, global health, human rights, and international organizations. He's proud to work with members of both parties to strengthen America's security and global leadership, and also the security of our allies. Congressman Bera lives in Elk Grove, California, with his wife Janine, and is also a medical doctor, and lives there with his daughter. But he's also been a great supporter of our South Asia Visiting Fellows program. In fact, he's one of the first people on Capitol Hill we reached out to set up meetings with our visiting fellows who come in a couple times a year from India and Pakistan to get a lay of the land of D.C., understand how the bureaucratic and political processes produce foreign policy. And the Congressman's always been a willing participant to host them and lend his insights. So we're greatly appreciative of that. And without further ado, Congressman Bera.
Well, thank you, Samir. I think part of this is Samir happens to be a neighbor of my chief of staff. So in the interest of keeping peace in the neighborhood, which is the topic of today's conversation, how do we keep peace in the neighborhood? And when I think about my 3 terms in Congress and when I first got here, I knew I would be involved. Being the only South Asian member of Congress when I first arrived, I knew I would focus in on South Asia and certainly strategically wanted to get on the Foreign Affairs Committee. But what surprised me was how few of my colleagues were actually focused on what I think is an incredibly complicated but incredibly vibrant region of the world. I mean, I would argue there's an overweight focus in Congress on the Middle East and North Africa. Certainly very complicated, very, very big challenges, but was very supportive of President Obama's pivot to Asia and understanding that, again, my opinion, in the 21st century, the opportunities and the challenges, frankly, that we will see in the Asian Pacific and certainly in South Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, are going to be very important. So part of my mission in my time in Congress has been to try to encourage and engage many of my colleagues to become interested in the region, to try to get more people to travel to the region, and also understand how the region looks at the United States and the things that we may say on the floor of the House, the things that we may feel are somewhat innocuous often end up on the front page of the newspapers in India and Pakistan, in the region. An errant tweet here or there becomes policy. And, it's incredibly important for us to understand that. Now, I'll stand up here and be very honest with the folks in this room. Much of my focus has been on U.S.-India and the opportunities there, but you can't think of the U.S.-India relationship without thinking of the India-Pakistan relationship. You can't think of what our mission in Afghanistan is without thinking about India and Pakistan in relation to that entire mission. And, I am not a stable genius on the issue of India and Pakistan, and I will readily acknowledge that I'm in a room full of people who are focused on this issue and have perspective. So in my comments, I thought I would lay out the flip side of investigating crisis, because I think it's incredibly important to understand what could go wrong and how you avoid what could go wrong. But the flip side of that coin is, what's the opportunity as well? How do we, if we understand what could go wrong and we have a desire to avoid what goes wrong, how do we as the United States and Congress, as well as the administration, try to recognize what could go right? And how do we work towards what could go right? So, if I frame my thinking around the relationship, let me touch on a couple areas. As we look at India, we look at India's economic growth. We look at the relationships that was in Japan recently, and certainly there's a lot of conversation going on between Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Moeed, and the relationship between Japan and India. Lots of discussion on the strategic dialogue between the U.S., India, Japan. The Japanese would like it to be a quadrilateral conversation with Australia in terms of security interests in the Indo-Pacific region. And as those dynamics in the U.S. relationship become a little bit more India-centric, as India's economy starts to grow, as India, the conversation around India becoming a permanent member of the UN Security Council, as the rest of the world starts to welcome India to the table, how does Pakistan perceive that? And what does that do to the relationship? And I think it's incredibly important for us to think about, that dynamic. Does that push Pakistan towards China? Do they start to develop different relationships with the world? And in that, none of these are isolated relationships. How does China see itself in the region and in the world? And how do we as the United States certainly try to bring China in as a partner in creating stability? Where's the Chinese ego? Where are their sensibilities? Again, incredibly complicated. As India's role with Russia changes and so forth, and I think India will continue to have a relationship with Russia. What are the dynamics there? India, Iran, what are the dynamics there? Pakistan, Iran, what are the dynamics there? And as we try to bring those players into to have a bigger role in diplomacy, India offers the ability to have conversations with Iran that we're not able to have because of their deeper and historic relationship. Again, what I'm doing is I'm framing how I'm thinking about this and how I think those of us on the Asia and Pacific subcommittee ought to be thinking about this. What's the United States' role in foreign policy going forward? Certainly, I think I'm stating the obvious, but President Trump has been a disruptive force, certainly challenging, what in past administrations we probably would have just agreed were norms. Well, what's the opportunity in that disruption? I think what the Trump administration certainly has gotten our allies around the world to question American commitment and American engagement. And I would argue, many of us are traveling more than we ever have, mostly because we recognize now is a time for congressional engagement. If we don't have our diplomats on the ground, well, it matters when a member of Congress shows up in another country to talk about who we are, and to reassure allies that we'll remain committed to the world and to the region. But our commitment may be different, and I would argue that in the 70 years, post-World War II, American leadership was absolutely necessary. Our economy was the dominant economy. It was necessary that we rebuild Europe, that we rebuild Japan, engage in South Korea. And I think that engagement was incredibly important in lifting people out of poverty and creating stable democracies. I could also argue that the next 70 years may be different in terms of how the United States engages. We have our own domestic challenges, and I don't, being a physician and being pragmatic, try to understand where we are as a nation, and there certainly are domestic challenges that we have here. That doesn't mean we withdraw from the world. That means maybe we engage in the world in a slightly different way, partnering with countries and allies that share similar values of democracy, values of free market, values of opportunity. My comments at the Mount Fuji Dialogue in Japan, it was about how we partner with those nations to then go into third regions. And in this case, I do think it's important that, as potentially the U.S. and Japan and China go into South Asia and think about those solutions, that it's not just the U.S. leading these conversations, but it is, again, partners looking for similar opportunities. What are the opportunities between India and Pakistan? We've raised questions of, as India's economy develops, are there opportunities to increase trade between India and Pakistan? As Pakistan addresses some of its energy needs and insecurities, its electrical grid, and are there opportunities there to work and create a dialogue where India may help Pakistan? These are pipe dreams in some ways and very complicated issues, but can you create a context where they work together? So that I'm framing a bit of my thinking, and I'm an optimist. I think you have to be an optimist if you want to run for Congress right now, and you want to hop on a plane every week and fly across the country, and I'll hop on a plane and I'll fly back this afternoon. But outside of the crisis, a war erupting on the Korean Peninsula or a war erupting in South Asia, everything else is an opportunity, right? And I think it's important for us to think about it in that context. So I'll stop with that, and I'm happy to take a couple questions.
All right, I'm going to try to do this with my mic here. So the Congressman's agreed to take a few questions, and surprise, surprise, I'm going to ask the first one. So Congressman, picking up on your point about this administration sort of being somewhat of a bucking sort of past behavior from the United States and being a little bit of disruptive force, one of the insights I think that the Stimson Center has generated over the last 10 or 15 years of work by Michael Crapon as well as by Nayak on the U.S. role in past crises is that the U.S. has been sort of very active, very present in order to ratchet down temperatures and try to stabilize things when they flare up. So if there is another South Asian crisis between India and Pakistan, will the Trump administration need to be as active as its predecessors, as the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration as well, in managing these crises to ensure U.S. interests? Or can it allow the two countries to work things out themselves, or allow for another third party to play that role?
Right. I think that's a great question. I for one think the United States has to be involved and engaged in those conversations. But sticking to the theme of what I think our diplomatic role in the 21st century potentially is, it may not be the United States by itself. It may be looking for other nations that have deeper relationships in that region to partner with us, to have that dialogue. At the same time, empowering both India and Pakistan, if a crisis to resolve some of their own conflicts and dialogues. And again, in some ways, it's that role of being facilitator. And it's complicated, right? I mean, as Madeline Albright will say, in diplomacy, you don't have to like the person who's sitting on the other side of the table. You just have to get to the table often and start the conversation. And I don't think the United States at this particular point, or the Trump administration at this particular point, can dictate what path forward occurs. I think we can certainly. I think we have to have an honest recognition that China is going to have a bigger role in the region, and I think it would be in our interest to focus on how do we help guide China's role in that region. China certainly wants to be seen as a world leader and as a player. That doesn't threaten me as an American, and in fact, I'd like China to have a bigger role as a world leader. Russia certainly wants to reestablish its ego, and again, doesn't threaten me as an American, and I don't think it should threaten us. But how do we help guide them to be responsible leaders? And that I think is an important question. I can't see a 21st century conflict between India and Pakistan where China doesn't have a role in helping resolve that. Now, will China do it in solely a China-centric way? And I think there's some question as how they engage in diplomacy and development. Often it's in a China-centric way. I'd argue the U.S., when we engage diplomatically in development, it's a little bit more benevolent, but let's not fool ourselves. We're also looking at what's in America's interest when we engage as well.
Well, we should have had you write a chapter on this maybe next time. All right, so I can take a couple questions from the audience for the Congressman. So, Sharon. Oh, we got the mic all the way over there. We can make it happen.
This is always dangerous when you're in a room full of smarter people than yourself.
Thank you, Congressman. Sharon Squassoni. I'm with George Washington University. First question is a little bit of a tough one. Do you think the Trump administration, by cutting off aid to Pakistan, has just taken away the table? And the second question is with regard to China's role. China has had a very different approach towards Pakistan's nuclear arsenal than the U.S. has. That's kind of understating it. So one thing I worry about as a non-proliferation expert is if we cede more influence to China, what hope is there actually for reducing risks with respect to Pakistan's nuclear arsenal? Thanks.
Yeah. I wish I could answer the first question. And I hope there was a strategy behind the tweet, that it was thought through, that it wasn't just an errant tweet based on something the president may have recently read or seen, but that there was a strategy behind it. I think my frustration as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee is historically, when we've looked at foreign policy, we may have different approaches as Democrats or Republicans or with one administration or another, but we've always recognized we're on the same team when we were speaking to the rest of the world. And I do think the challenge, first off, let me say this: if there are former State Department employees or current State Department employees, thank you for your service. You do a remarkable job representing us around the world. That said, I do worry a lot about the staffing at State, and the fact that we don't have all our undersecretary positions filled, and for South Asia, certainly. I would wish, if there is a strategy there, that they would bring us in as members of Congress, and prior administrations have done that, and we've had that open dialogue, whether in classified or open settings, because we also recognize when we have a hearing or when we make statements to the press, we can reinforce the strategy, or we can raise issues that the administration sometimes can't. So I can't necessarily answer that question because they haven't had that conversation with us to talk about what their strategic goal with that tweet is. I'd be speculating on, where it is. I do think even under the Obama administration, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship and the relationship with regards to aid to Pakistan was changing as it was, but it's complicated, right? If we worry about the rapid proliferation of nuclear weapons in Pakistan, making smaller and more mobile nuclear arsenal as well is pretty worrisome. And we understand, certainly I understand some of why we've supported through aid, the military government in terms of trying to secure that arsenal. I do think there's a potential strategy of how do we strengthen civilian institutions in Pakistan? How do we strengthen a civilian government? And that's a conversation for all of you to have. And then when you come up with the answer, please deliver that to members of Congress and let us know how we can be of assistance. The China question is a complicated one. So let's acknowledge that China will have a role in the region. Let's acknowledge that China's role could be beneficial. It could make things more complicated. And then let's think of what is that strategy to make it more beneficial. And when you speak to the Indians, they don't want to be a pawn in U.S.-China. They don't want to be pushed to say, okay, we're going to, ally with America or China. I think they recognize that in their neighborhood, they're going to have relationships with both China and India or the United States. Again, I'm not giving you a direct answer other than I think it's worth our thinking through how do we allow China to be a more benevolent partner in the region, understanding that China will always be China-centric. I think we as members of Congress and we as folks that, that we need to understand the Chinese ego, in the broad sense, and how we allow them to become those world. They're going to be a world power. They are a world power, and how do we make them a responsible world power and not a competitor, but in some ways a collaborator and a leader in the region. Again, not easy to do, but we ought to be thinking about this in the long term, a decade or two.
And I really like your idea that when our diplomatic game is on the back foot, that members of Congress can sort of step in and fill that.
We absolutely have to right now.
Yeah. All right, so we have time for one more question. This one right here. Just wait for the mic and please introduce yourself as well.
Beverly Lindsay, University of California, multi-campus. So thank you, Congressman, for your comments.
As a UC graduate.
Yes.
Go Bears.
Since I'm at a university, and of course our system is quite extensive, are there 2 or 3 main areas that you think that as universities we can contribute to your and other Congress people, but also in terms of partnerships? Because we have a number of research partnerships with countries throughout the world, but are there other areas that we should also consider?
Yeah, so I think in the 60s and 70s, probably one of our best diplomatic moves was the foreign exchange program. The vast number of students that we allowed to come here and get their education, to understand who we are as a people, to experience what it means to be in America and the values of America. Travel, many of those students in the 60s and 70s are now the leaders in their own country. And in fact, I think the leader in Pakistan, had his education here at UCLA. That is a good thing because they have the ability, many of those people have the ability of separating who we are as Americans, certainly at times from our government policy. So one thing we absolutely could do is be more welcoming to students that are go to Pakistan, go to India, there's a real desire for folks to come here and get their education. But let's do the flip. I don't think we've done a great job sending our students to India or to Pakistan, and I think we really ought to do more of that in a proactive way. So I think that type of academic exchange certainly is incredibly important. I think a second thing, and this is something that I certainly have thought about and tried to focus on in my 3 terms in Congress. You have a South Asian diaspora, Pakistani American and Indian American diaspora that really is maturing, that is growing. The Pakistani American community has actually been more politically engaged, I think, than the Indian American community. But how can you engage the diaspora here to help solve some of the challenges in South Asia in a strategic and meaningful way? The Indian American community now is the most affluent community in America. How can you harness some of those resources to make investments in that region? Now, it's also complicated because some of the Indian American diaspora is still fighting battles from 40 or 50 years ago, but the generation rising doesn't see those battles. And how do you engage the 2 communities to potentially be partners in solving some of these issues? Because again, certainly there are resources in both communities. I think certainly the Pakistani American diaspora has a real desire and I think deeper connections to politics in Pakistan. But how do we, and maybe that's something Stimson ought to do, is think about bringing some of the leaders from both communities together to talk about how the 2 diasporas, and it's not just a U.S. diaspora, because you see both diasporas all around the world, in England and in Africa and other places. So maybe there's an opportunity there. So.
Well, Congressman, thank you so much for your time and for your insights, and we'll be in touch about that editor loan.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
All right, well, running a little bit behind schedule, but why don't I ask the first panel to join me on the podium here, and we'll get started. Just ask you to turn your mic on. So just no, yeah, no problem, no problem. Mr. Ambassador, can I ask you to just turn your mics on? If he shows me, I can just turn them on for you. Oh, yeah. Can we get a copy of the book? Okay, so we're joined here by a fairly austere group of practitioner scholars who've served many years in their respective governments and thought about and lived through and worked on crises in South Asia. And so this is an opportunity for a reflection on their insights based on their practice and experience, and then sort of reflections afterwards. So Ambassador Saran and Ambassador Khan were both foreign secretaries in India and Pakistan. They were also contributors to this volume. So I encourage you to take a look at their chapters. They wrote on some very interesting aspects of crisis I don't think we necessarily think about all the time: the role of organization and organizational dynamics, and whether those hold up under pressure, under stress in crises. And then the role of communication between bilateral communications, internal communications, and whether those remain durable during downturns in relations, and what opportunities or costs there are to maintaining those channels of communication. And then, of course, Nayak has authored a number of publications published by Stimson, reflecting on the U.S. as a third-party crisis manager when we know there's a crisis, how we react to it, a potential set of actions that the United States can take in order to subdue, stifle, or mitigate the consequences of a future crisis. So I've asked each of them to prepare some opening remarks based on their past writings and just reflections about the sort of the state of play in South Asia today. And perhaps hopefully we'll learn a little bit more about what we've learned from past crises, what this means for a future sort of challenge or contingency in the future, and even what Congressman Bera referred to as opportunities that can be, harnessed from future crisis contingencies. So we'll go down the list of presenters. Let me go ahead and read you. You all have the bios in front of you, but I'll just read it for our audience tuning in. So we have Ambassador Riaz Khan, who spent nearly 40 years in Pakistan's foreign service, holding various assignments at Pakistani missions around the world. His diplomatic career included stints as Foreign Secretary from 2005 to 2008, Ambassador to China. Prior to that, spokesman of the Foreign Office, and a number of other postings. He served as the head of the Pakistani delegation to the Pakistan-India Composite Dialogue. And prior to joining, this is, I think, the most interesting thing I learned about Ambassador Khan. I've learned it many times over our conversations in the past few years. But he taught quantum physics at Punjab University. He's a mathematician by training, and he would love to tell you more about advanced mathematics and things that we can't fully, as policymakers, practitioners, can't fully comprehend. But he's up there in the clouds in terms of his cerebral production. Ambassador Shyam Saran is an Indian career diplomat. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1970, became Foreign Secretary to the government of India from 2004 to 2006. So these gentlemen have a history together, as you can tell. Prior to his appointment as Foreign Secretary, he served as India's ambassador to Myanmar, Indonesia, Nepal, and High Commissioner to Mauritius. He was also the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Indo-US nuclear deal, and he's a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and a member of the Institute of Chinese Studies Governing Council. And then finally, Polly Nayak, who's retired in 2002 as a senior government executive after a wide-ranging intelligence career. And as a longtime South Asia expert, she was the intelligence community's most senior expert and manager on South Asia from 1995 to 2001. It was a pretty quiet time around that, as I understand. Her publications with the Stimson Center include U.S. crisis management in South Asia's Twin Peaks crises and the unfinished crisis, U.S. crisis management after 2008 Mumbai attacks. So with this eminent panel, we'll start with Ambassador Riaz Khan for some just ask each of the panelists maybe 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll try to play catch up a little bit with Q&A as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lalwani. First for inviting me here. And I must say that we had the comments from Congressman Bera, which were very positive, and it's a good start for your endeavor today. We are missing our good friend Michael Crepon. I wish him a speedy recovery. I'm very happy to see my old friend Shyam Saran. We have been together in many meetings and conferences, but I think this is the first time that we are together in a kind of a seminar setting. About conflict and crises, lessons from the past, I have a chapter which I have contributed, and I have gone in some detail there, and I hope that you will find it worthwhile to glance through it whenever you have the time. But here I would like to throw light on three aspects. First, what can we learn from experiences of past conflicts and crises in relations between Pakistan and India? Second, the present dangerous situation following the two countries becoming overt nuclear weapon states. And the third, some of the key points I have made with regard to avoiding another conflict and how crises can be brought under control or averted. What can we learn from past experiences? First point in this regard is that Kashmir lies at the heart of the 70 years of conflict and tension in Pakistan-India relations. If Kashmir were resolved, perhaps the trajectory of this relationship could have been very different. Pakistan would have had no motivation to respond and pursue a nuclear option. This is what I believe, if Kashmir were resolved. Perhaps the two countries could have lived together as the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had once envisaged, like the United States and Canada. Instead, however, we have had 3 wars over the dispute. Even now, there is a simmering agitation in the valley. Only a couple of months back, you may have seen statements by former Foreign Minister Yusuf Sinha and the former Chief Minister Farooq Abdullah expressing concern over Kashmiri alienation, which they say has to be addressed. One thing is very clear, that disputes and problems, if left unaddressed, do not necessarily fade away, especially if these relate to the rights of a people. Kashmir, I always believed, is resolvable. It is a political, not an ideological dispute. We have in 2 other, Siachen and Sir Creek, 2 disputes which are entirely territorial, as I look at it. Again, those 2 issues can also be resolved in innovative ways, turning them from arenas of conflict to areas of cooperation for the benefit of the 2 countries and, importantly, the environment. The second point is the question of terrorism. It has a wider context, especially the greater Middle East, what is happening there, and that affects very deeply Pakistan. I'll make a few comments in the context of Pakistan-India relationship. Pakistan absolutely gains nothing from any acts of terrorism against India. I have dwelt on this argument in some detail in the chapter which I have contributed in this book. Following the Mumbai attacks almost a decade ago, which Pakistan had condemned, India moved this issue to the central stage of dialogue between the 2 countries. Pakistan agrees to discuss terrorism and cooperation to combat it, and there has even been some instances of cooperation, but Pakistan insists that the dialogue must be inclusive and address all issues. Something similar to the composite dialogue that we had, but in my view, the question of format and how to go about it, nomenclature, they are secondary matters. The current absence of a formal dialogue between the 2 countries is, in my view, risky and dangerous. The third point I would make in this context of experience relates to the assumption that progress on soft issues such as trade, culture, and people-to-people context can help transform political atmosphere and even pave the way for resolution of political disputes. While there can be no denial of the desirability of progress on soft issues, experience shows that it proves to be fragile and whittles away under a crisis, or even sometimes when there is a change of government in one capital or the other. On the other hand, resolution of a political dispute can become a more solid foundation for mutual trust. In my view, progress on resolving Siachen in 2011, when Pakistan had lost more than 140 soldiers in Gyari avalanche, that could have become a game changer. In fact, both sides are losing more lives there because of the weather conditions rather than because of the fight between the two. Now, the fourth point, on every issue which involves Pakistan and India, there are different perceptions on both sides, be it Kashmir, be it terrorism. I have the experience that even on such minor matters like allowing movement of diplomatic personnel in the respective capitals, when the two sides will sit down at the technical level, one would find that very soon they would paint themselves into corners. So there are these differing perceptions. If and when possible, when it becomes possible, when dialogue is resolved, we need to look for a way forward rather than try to convince the other from your own point of view. Positions need to be stated as long as they are held, but a serious diplomatic effort has to rest on finding accommodation and common ground. Lastly, in this context, I would say that while both countries have been through many conflicts and crises, they have resorted and accepted a rich catalog of modalities and approaches to contain these crises and conflicts and to address them. These have involved resort to the United Nations, third-party intercession, including the United States and the erstwhile Soviet Union, international mediation, bilateral contacts, unilateral steps. Nothing has been a taboo. This must remain so in the future. Here, both countries have a responsibility, and the international community too has an obligation to be sensitive and remain engaged to the need for containing and help arresting crises from escalation. The second aspect which I had mentioned relates to the dangers of the current situation. These are most poignantly evident in India's cold start doctrine and Pakistan's riposte that contemplates going beyond tactical nuclear weapons to miniaturization and battlefield nuclear weapons. I have argued in this chapter, which I have contributed, that these are dangerous doctrines and the two sides should retreat from them. Citing from the chapter, I have said, the premise that a sub-conventional, which is terrorism, act should provoke a massive conventional retaliation, which in turn must be countered by an unconventional limited nuclear response, is deeply flawed. The key assumptions underlying this spiral of escalation must be questioned. These precepts are too dangerous for hardball or wargaming by those steeped in a military culture of suspicion and strategies of action, counter-action. Any scenario inexorably leading to a nuclear exchange is insane in the extreme, such a trajectory should be considered only to develop mutually agreed intercepts, wire trips, and mechanisms to contain the crisis. Diplomacy and dialogue must intervene at every point of the trajectory to avert a catastrophe. This is what I'm quoting from the chapter that I have contributed. Nuclear deterrence is now an integral part of the security paradigms of the two countries. This poses a classic dilemma. They must learn to live with this reality while making a nuclear exchange unthinkable. The third and the last aspect relates to suggestions for avoiding and managing crises. In this book chapter, I have grouped these so-called recommendations or suggestions into 6 baskets: revive dialogue, expand dialogue process, improve existing CBMs, eliminate nuclear exchange possibility, avoid communication breakdown, and acknowledging both states' nuclear statuses. These are essentially security-related measures, but there can be others. For example, a friend of mine who was former deputy head of UNEP, Shafkat Kakakhel, you know him, he once told me that an agreement between the two sides under the Indus Water Basin Treaty for a regular exchange of telemetry data has become a vital CBM to avoid aggravating water issues, apart from a better understanding of water flows in a scenario of climate change. I have not included this or similar other possible CBMs in my list in the chapter. But here I'll only flag three points. First, I have suggested regular bilateral summit-level meetings. And as Congressman Bera had mentioned, that whether we like each other or not, I think this is an important. This ought to be considered as an important arrangement when conceived. At least, say, once in 3 years. Experience shows that bilateral summits are always better prepared and have always, summit-level meetings, have always led to some cooling off and even progress. Such an arrangement, regardless of the state of relations, should be beneficial and needed for the two countries which happen to be nuclear weapon states and neighbors. Second, regular top-level military and intelligence contacts, say once in 2 years. These could be under wraps or open. Today, there is no denying of the important role that military plays in critical decisions relating to security and foreign policy issues, not just in Pakistan, but almost in any other country. Militaries have a particular perspective, and such contexts can contribute to confidence building. You may have noted that a week ago, there were reports of an unpublicized meeting between the national security advisors of the two countries in Bangkok. If so, if it has taken place, it is a salutary development. Third point is the role of the international community. Regional and extra-regional powers have played a positive role in diffusing crises in the past, bringing down tension. This role should remain available to the two countries. Now, much of what I have said here, or in the chapter which I have contributed, may appear to be, under the present circumstances, as Congressman Bera had said, pipe dream. Nonetheless, this does not change the realities of the two countries being neighbors and being nuclear weapon states. Therefore, they cannot hold back, and this is one of the conclusions that I have in the chapter, for long on steps similar to those which have been proposed for a long time. Thank you.
Ambassador Saran.
Thank you very much, and let me congratulate the Stimson Center on the publication of this book on managing crises, which has a set of very useful contributions. And I'm very happy to have an opportunity to once again meet my old friend, Riaz. He and I were foreign secretaries during the period 2004 to 2006, and I may perhaps also say that that was one of the better periods, although I don't know whether I should credit ourselves for that, but it just so happened that they were somewhat better than they normally are. My chapter, of course, does not go into the dynamics of India-Pakistan relations as much as looking at crisis management from an Indian perspective, and to see how whether or not India has in place the kind of mechanisms which are necessary in order to deal with crisis and perhaps prevent crises from escalating. And I have shown that in some cases we have been more successful, other cases we have not been so successful. So the lesson that I have drawn is that in fact what has worked has been the reliance on very well-established institutions and procedures. When we have allowed them to work, they have actually delivered in terms of managing crisis. It is when we have, for whatever reason, moved away from those established institutions and procedures that crises have actually escalated. And it's my belief that had we allowed those institutions and processes to actually work, perhaps the kind of escalation which eventually came about could have been prevented. So they would not have become a bigger crisis if they had been contained right in the initial stage. So that's not just with respect to India-Pakistan. This is more a general kind of conclusion that I come to. Let me also say that although I would have hoped that much more would have been done in terms of learning from past experience, we are still some distance away from that. But in the recent couple of years, perhaps there has been a greater recognition in India that we need to have a much stronger focus on the institutional aspect and the processes that need to be followed in dealing with crisis. As far as the India-Pakistan relationship is concerned, of course, I have certainly no difference of opinion with Riaz on the need to have a constant engagement between the two sides. That there should be even summit level meetings between the two countries. Engagement is in fact one of the best ways of dealing or preventing crises from emerging. My own experience, for example, in the relationship with China, which is another very important relationship for us, where also there are differences of opinion and sometimes crises do erupt. But it has been our experience that the willingness of the leadership of the two countries to engage in very regular summits and meetings has actually played a very important role in keeping the relationship on some kind of an even keel. And that was most recently demonstrated by the manner in which the two countries were able to deal with what is known as the Doklam issue. Can that be a lesson for India and Pakistan? Yes, it could be, but the problem is that, every time perhaps a effort is made on the Indian side to reach out at the leadership level, there are perhaps forces at work who make certain that the positive impact of the summit is vitiated. So even Mr. Modi, who's regarded as a somewhat tough leader, he took a huge political gamble by going to Lahore and visiting Nawaz Sharif. And there was an expectation that this would lead to a better relationship. But as we saw, like also in the past, the initiative was again sort of followed by some major cross-border terrorist attacks, and that put paid to whatever positive impact there could have been from such summit meetings. If you remember, the same thing happened with Atal Bihari Vajpayee and his famous bus trip to Lahore and the subsequent Kargil incident which took place. So what seems to have worked in the case of India-China does not seem to always work in the India-Pakistan case. I would agree with Riaz on one point, which is that part of the difficulty in managing the India-Pakistan relationship is precisely the very different historical narratives that the two countries have. Why did partition occur? If you ask Pakistan, there will be a different answer. If you ask anybody in India, there will be a different answer. Why did the Kashmir War erupt immediately after independence? Again, there will be very different answers to that question. Why did 1965 happen? Why did 1971 happen? Why did Kargil happen? Or more recently, whatever happened? There are very different interpretations on the Pakistani side, on the Indian side. I'm not going into whether which interpretation is correct or which interpretation is wrong, but the fact is that there are very, very different interpretations. Which makes me believe that any kind of improvement of relations between the two countries will not be in the form of some kind of a grand reconciliation, problems are all resolved, Kashmir issue is solved, and we are back on track. No, I don't think that will happen. I think what will have to happen for some kind of a positive relationship to be established between the two countries will only be through a gradual alignment of the historical narratives on both sides. As long as those narratives continue to be diametrically opposed to one another, I do not see the possibility of any kind of a grand reconciliation or improvement in the relationship. Which points me to the need for perhaps focusing attention on what modest steps that you can take to improve relations. They may be very ordinary kind of measures, like some of the measures which we undertook earlier, encouraging, say, people-to-people's relations and pilgrimages between the two countries, trade, various other such measures, which Riaz says, if the main issue is not resolved, these may not really work in terms of improving relationship. My answer to that is that the more complicated the dispute between the two countries, chances are that there will be a greater prospect of resolving those issues, provided the overall atmosphere of the relationship is better. In fact, in a situation of acute hostility, it is even less likely that the problems will be resolved. So I think while we should not shy away from trying to deal with what he describes as the core issue from the Pakistani point of view, but I think there will be better chances of dealing with that if we were also engaged in those modest steps to improve the relationship. And the improvement in relationship, to my mind, will come as a cumulative cumulative result of these smaller steps rather than one big step of, say, resolving the Kashmir issue. Also, my sense is that being engaged in these modest measures is perhaps more realistic at this point of time, precisely because of what I mentioned. As soon as there is a prospect of some very major change in the relationship in a positive direction, we always find that there is a reaction to that. Now, for whatever reason, whether it is the Pakistani military or whether it is the Pakistani establishment, feels very threatened if there is a real prospect for improvement of relations. So, that is just the reality. That has been our experience. So I think we have to take that into account. As far as the nuclear issue is concerned, I think it is perhaps very important for both sides not to give in to the temptation of brinkmanship and trying to raise the ante so that the other side feels constrained. The problem with this is that we do not know at which point we can actually prevent escalation from happening. So when we have spoken on the Indian side that when we talk about any kind of nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, that exchange will probably end up in a strategic exchange. So even if there may be the intention to limit it to merely a tactical exchange, our own experience tells us that nothing can be contained. Once nuclear weapons has been used, once that threshold has been crossed, whatever exercises we do seems to point to escalation to the strategic level. So I don't think that one should even talk about how nuclear weapons could be used in the context of India-Pakistan conflict. With respect to this exercise that has been carried out, I would say that while it is a good account of how crises have erupted and how they have unfolded, and it's good to look at the theoretical aspect in terms of what are the drivers of crises or what are the warning signs with respect to crisis. But as you have yourself pointed out, Sameer, in your chapter, that it is very difficult to actually reduce crisis to simply a function of specific conditions, exact variables, or distinct thresholds. Instead, it is a very subjective position, and it is clearly influenced by whatever may be at that point of time, political considerations, or even the perceptions and the actions of leadership. And this is something that we have to just accept, that there is no objective way of actually dealing with crisis. Secondly, I think a point has been made that if we look at the various crises, at least since 86, 87, and Michael's chapter has a reference to that, he says that all subsequent to 86, 87, all nuclear tinged crises have been prompted by actions originating from within Pakistan. Now, why have those actions originated from Pakistan? What are the drivers of those trigger points? I think that may be worth also looking at. And also it has been mentioned that if crises have not escalated, it is mainly on account of Indian restraint. And perhaps it might be worth looking at why the Indians have been restrained, despite the fact that there has been such kind of crisis, which has not been India's doing. Because that, I think, would perhaps give us more useful information as to what is really involved in terms of crisis origination and also crisis escalation. Now, I would like to just end by saying that it certainly remains my view that engagement between India and Pakistan at all levels is something that I would certainly welcome, even when there are very difficult relations between the two sides. And I am encouraged to note that despite the very difficult relationship that exists at this point of time, channels of communication continue to be used. And Riaz himself has made mention to the fact that the national security advisors of the two countries are in touch with one another. And also, I would say that diplomatic channels between the two sides continue to be active. So it's not as if communications are not taking place. We would have hoped, of course, that these are raised to a much higher level than what we see today. Thank you.
Yes. Well, these were two extremely interesting presentations that are in some ways reflective of the chapters in the book, not just the chapters by these two gentlemen, but also other chapters concerning their the different perspectives, the opposing approaches, and to a lesser degree, the differing structural issues in how the countries approach relations with each other. You know, and it seems to me very logical that the chapters on India should focus on mechanisms within India, because the policy apparatus for foreign relations and security is much more complex, has far more moving parts than is true in Pakistan, where the military has a lead role in both, and there are simply a less complex institutional arrangements than in India. India, like the U.S., has a messy collection of different pieces that have to constantly adapt and work more efficiently together. And so I think the different focuses of these two conversations reflect, in part, institutional differences in their internal workings. I thought this book was magnificent. I have to agree with Ambassador Saran that when all is said and done, and I think you and Hannah said this very explicitly, the decision as to what comprises a crisis is a very political decision. There's nothing really objective that can define it. And I would add something to that, which I think is quite important. And again, I think both ambassadors have alluded to it. And that is that anger, I don't think you alluded to it directly, but anger is also a factor. You talked about leadership, and that's certainly true, different leaders, different personalities. But when I go back and think about Shiv Shankar Menon's book, Choices, and I look back at his reaction to the 2008 Mumbai attacks, his anger was what he led with. It's not what defined the final Indian response, which was very restrained. But I think we sometimes forget how much interpersonal dynamics and discussions among different parts of leaderships affect outcomes. I think that's a very dialectic process, and the conclusions that different parties bring to the table play into the outcome, depending on, again, group dynamics. So it seems to me that outcomes are far more specific and reflect the roles of different personalities as well as institutions than some of the more theoretical discussions would suggest. I was very impressed by the chapters, in addition to those of the two ambassadors, on media, the role of media, which I think is very important and often ignored. And the question on the Indian side of informing public opinion in a more systematic way rather than simply responding to it. I think that was really fascinating. And in fact, that was part of your chapter, Ambassador, as well. So very, very interesting. The chapter on intelligence, particularly in India, was fascinating. And I was struck particularly by the similarity of some of the suggestions for improving internal mechanisms in India to discussions that have gone on in the US in the past. Again, because we both have messy systems with lots of moving parts. I thought the discussion of how capacity sometimes becomes the defining element in an outcome was fascinating, because I think it's true in the US as well. The what can we do comes up as right at the front end. What are actually realistic options? And having sat through a lot of senior decision meetings, that I think is a common strand. Another is your recommendation to develop more regional expertise and to have closer ties between government and outside experts, think tank as well as university. And that's something U.S. Foreign policy makers and the foreign policy establishment have intermittently emphasized. And it's actually become quite an important piece of the foreign policy relationship with the private sector. So all of those things are common and very interesting. The lack of durable institutional mechanisms in both countries really is I think particularly striking. And I'm also struck by the fact that in India, some of the difficulties in coordinating between the security or military establishment and the civilian policymaking establishment are the result of India's tremendous effort to keep the military secondary in foreign policy making. It's a different dynamic from what we see in Pakistan. So it seems to me that, again, as in the US, some of these consequences follow from deliberate policies, deliberate emphases that are special to India and to a great degree to the US as well. So I thought these recommendations, with their different focuses, Ambassador Khan's on altering the structure and focus of the dialogue, and Ambassador Saran's on trying to build from the bottom up, reflect some of the reasons why much of the discussion between the two governments remains short of symmetry. They're very, very different narratives, but also very different concepts of what has to come first. The question of why India is restrained, and the twin question of why there are spoiler attacks when summits do occur between India and Pakistan and seem to be bearing fruit are obviously questions going forward that analysts will continue to study. We'll be talking shortly about the role of outside third parties, governments primarily, in buffering and perhaps preventing overreaction by both sides. And many analysts believe that both governments, India's and Pakistan's, however unhappy they may be to need to rely on outside parties, actually count on it. And so question going forward, which this book has raised and which Representative Bera also raised, is whether the U.S. will be as available and whether it will be able, in a different, perhaps less proactive role than it has adopted before, to serve as a coordinator, which has been its past role in outside discussions with leaders in both India and Pakistan in times of crisis. So those are real questions. I wanted to raise a point about having processes for government crisis response and even for dialogue between India and Pakistan in times of crisis. And I realize that India and Pakistan have their own informal mechanisms, and there is conversation that's simply not public in difficult times. It's not as though everything that happens in public is the sum total of what's actually occurring between two quite responsible governments. But I do want to mention the value of having government crisis responses in place, even if they are not actually completely utilized in the face of a crisis. It seems to me that the value of having such a process in place lies partly in the making of the plans, in the making of the response, because devising it requires thinking through the best ways to proceed, what the mechanics are, what the logistics look like, and in a worst case, the survival of government. So the very process of devising this is educational and forces senior people in a government to consider at least the elements, if not follow the procedures in a difficult time. I have to ask, how many of us, if we're faced with a smoke-filled corridor in a hotel, would try to read the emergency exit recommendations on the back of the door before leaving? So I do think there is value, but I wanted to bring to the conversation a point that has been raised in a number of research studies, and that is that unless the people who are actually going to be doing the crisis management, that is very senior officials in a country, are involved in drills or whatever, they have very little value. And that's the finding of several studies, because having a proxy run through a drill in lieu of the person who will actually be making the decision doesn't educate the senior policymaker, who will be on the front line, not the proxy. So I raise that simply because it argues for having the top officials themselves be involved in any sort of exercise, rather than sending someone who's a couple of levels below and won't actually have decision authority. So with that, I would particularly be interested in hearing if either of you cares to comment on the value of Track 2 discussions, which is a question that has come up in regard to other dyads, countries that have stressed relations, whether Track 2 is actually a good mechanism for at least trial balloons, short of official exploration at higher levels, or whether back-channel discussions that don't involve outside parties or non-government people are more valuable. And I suspect you each have an opinion based on your experience. But that would be a subject I'd be interested in hearing you pursue.
Well, why don't we turn that over then to the question of the utility of Track 2s, but also, Ambassador Saran, you talked about modest steps being sort of a one way to go. Are those advanced through these Track 2 mechanisms? Do they require Track 1 institutionalized structures that Ambassador Khan talked about? Can it or just use every
Yeah.
sort of mechanism available?
Exactly.
Please, yeah, why don't you start, sir?
Well, thank you. I'll address this track 2 question. But before that, I just want to make one point that unfortunately I have not read the book. I have only read my chapter, which I.
It's fair.
So I don't know what is there written by Mike in his essay. And there it was referred to by Shyam that all the problems, they were initiated somehow from Pakistan. Now there are few instances which come readily to mind. For example, Siachen, was it initiated in Pakistan, or there were also incursions in Chor Batla and Qamar sectors, etc. But far bigger than that, 1971. I don't want to touch on Kashmir because it's a category apart. It probably started even before Pakistan and India were partitioned. So the thing is that I don't want to dwell on this because I have not read that particular essay, and it would be unfair for me to comment on that. Now, the track 2 discussions. To my mind, track 2 discussions are useful. They are useful because in the world today, which is very complex, there is a need for interaction. Interaction which can lead things to a positive direction, even if at a given point of time, it doesn't appear to be very productive. Because otherwise, if we go on judging that this thing is how useful it is or how useful it is not, people are now doubting whether diplomacy at all has any usefulness. Whether it is the military strength and the economic strength, which basically is the arbiter of decisions and which shapes the relations between countries. But being a diplomat, and I think I can say it for Shyam also, because he had probably a longer career than myself, diplomacy is vital for the health of the world affairs and how we interact. So similarly, track 2, it is a good sort of modality for considering things. There are sometimes very useful ideas which are generated, or at least they are discussed, which sometimes it is very difficult to discuss in very formal settings. So that would be my sort of response to.
Yeah,
One other about soft issues and long. The argument that I have made in my is not that we deny that there is no utility of discussing softer issues, and if there is progress on softer issues, good. And one can also understand that there cannot be a uniform progress on all the issues that we discuss. But when there is a dialogue, then all the issues should be discussed. That was the argument that was being made by me. Thank you. Sorry.
So let me of course, agree entirely that engagement at all levels and amongst very different kind of actors, all these are very useful. So in the India-Pakistan context, I think Riaz has also taken part in some of those track 2s, so have I. There are also which I certainly would encourage, of Indian and Pakistanis from different spheres of life meeting each other, whether they are film actors coming and working in India, or performers from India going and performing in Pakistan. There is a very strong cultural affinity between the two sides, and those cultural affinities, my experience has been they have always had some positive impact in terms of the relationship between the two countries. So I'm all for those kind of engagement. But I think one has to recognize that ultimately resolving issues or even managing the adversarial relationship between the two countries requires work on the part of states. On that issue, I think Riaz made a very important point, and that is the value of diplomacy in terms of, if not resolving issues, at least managing issues. And diplomacy, it should be quite apparent, can only operate in grays. If you pose issues in black and white, you shrink the space for diplomacy. Therefore, whatever helps in creating some grayness in the relationship where diplomacy can work, I think is very, very critical. And I also share the apprehension that perhaps that space for diplomacy, those gray spaces may be shrinking. And I think it is extremely important that we do not allow that shrinkage to take place. I would agree with you with regard to the need for the officials who are going to be dealing with crisis to be actually engaged in the exercise of working out the processes and in the building up of the institution. I think you would see from my chapter that that is precisely what has been done in India. So the problem is that not that the institution is not there or the drills have not been laid out, very, very elaborate drills have been laid out, and the people who will be actually taking decisions are very much part and parcel of that. So if you look at the Central Crisis Management Group, all key actors are represented there. They know exactly what each one has to do and has the authority to do. It is when you do not use it that problems arise. And why do you not use it? Well, sometimes there is a sense, oh, this is a very delicate, sensitive political issue. Maybe it should be handled in some different, which is the wrong thing to do, obviously. So I do not think this may not be the experience in other countries, and I'm not so sure whether that's the experience in the US, but you seem to indicate that maybe it's a problem here as well. But it's not so much that the institutions are not there. But if you constantly keep putting them aside, then you do not be surprised if surprises occur.
Yeah, it seems to me, I just wanted to add one other thought to this, which is that as a crisis moves in, one tendency that seems to be quite universal is to narrow the group of people who are involved in the discussion, and that works against the kind of coordinated whole of government.
True, and then what is the best advice which is coming to the one person where the buck stops? In the case of India, the Prime Minister. So I can only recall what happened after Mumbai, because I could see what was happening. It would have been better if he had constantly the kind of inputs that could have come to him from this kind of a group, where all the moving parts that you are talking about would have been represented, because everyone was getting only a small bit of the picture, not the complete picture. So you needed a platform where all this could come together, and then you could go to the political leadership, who would still have to take the decision. But I think though he took the decision, despite the pressure on him to retaliate, though he took the decision not to retaliate, I cannot say that that was based on a very careful assemblage of intelligence information, which then allowed him to take that decision. I think that decision was something of an instinctive reaction that retaliation may lead to worse consequences than would address, even though there was this kind of question.
Interesting. Thank you.
Well, I've failed my job to moderate this panel because I've been so captivated with the discussion, but I will try to have a firmer hand here in Q&A. We have a little bit of time. I'll try to bundle some questions. Please introduce yourself, wait for the microphone, limit yourself to one question succinctly as possible, and we'll start with this gentleman over here.
Yeah, good morning.
Can you just wait for the microphone?
Good morning. My name is James Cladd. I was in the OSD policy defense under the last years of the W. Bush administration. I just wanted to add my voice to Polly's call for recurrent exercises ahead of crises, and just say that you may have been involved, Polly, I can't remember, but we had a series of fire drills, we called them, in 2007, early 2008, which had the great effect of acclimatizing just the building, the Pentagon itself, to some of the issues involved. And it turned out to be a very, very helpful exercise ahead of the Mumbai business. So that's an absolutely essential thing to do and to keep doing.
Thank you. Take a couple more and add on to. So, Hamza, you want to right here?
Mohammed Omar, writer from Pakistan. I have a question for both the ambassadors. What do you owe, or what factor do you credit to in the restraint India has shown in the past crises in the past 2 decades, if not to nuclear deterrence? And does that not justify Pakistan's dependence on nuclear weapons?
Okay, and let's take one more. This gentleman here.
Yes, Salim Ali, professor at University of Delaware. Question to Ambassador Saran. I concur with you in terms of the role the Pakistani military may have played in impeding conflict resolution, but in your own recent book, you have noted that in the case of Siachen, it was General J.J. Singh and the Indian National Security Advisor who thwarted the last-minute peace deal on Siachen. Lieutenant General Ghazi was in Delhi with the peace agreement, and so I'm wondering if the more productive conversation might be around how collectively the military can be made to see value in peace on both sides, rather than this constant incrimination of one side's military, which is the narrative in DC. And going back to General Eisenhower's caution about the military-industrial complex, I think that might be a more productive way, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
Okay, so we'll take these 3 questions: fire drills, deterrence, and Siachen and the military. Maybe we can start with Paul and just go down the line.
Oh, I'm going to defer.
Okay.
Well, no, I take this point. First of all, yes, militaries have varying roles. In some countries more, in some countries less. But look, when it comes to Pakistan-India relationship, I don't think that the Indian military has a lesser role than the Pakistani military has on this particular issue. So, it's issue to issue. On many other things, certainly the Indian other institutions must be having a very strong role. But the other question I couldn't really follow. What was it, that it is the nuclear thing or whatever?
How do you explain India's restraint in the crises that have happened in the past 2 decades, if not nuclear deterrence? And does that not justify Pakistan's dependence on nuclear weapons?
No, nuclear weapons, development of nuclear weapons, that's a very separate issue. Pakistan did not pursue this course right in the beginning from 1960s or so. It started pursuing it earnestly from 1974 onwards. So this is one thing. We had to do it. There may be difference of opinions within Pakistan on this issue, but I think that today the nuclear deterrence is an integral part of our security. There should be no question about it. As far as Pakistani establishment is concerned, which is both civilian and the military, there are no doubts on this question. The crises, they have happened like crises have happened before, but the arguments that I have made in this chapter is that there is need for formal and solid institutional mechanism which can help the two countries to prevent crises from happening, or if they happen, then to arrest them.
Yeah, so I have a different opinion about the role of the armed forces in India. That the armed forces have a very important input into decision making, that is certainly true. And even if we talk about the specific instance of Siachen, the issues that were raised were not raised by the military establishment, it was raised by the security establishment, which was at that particular point of time was endorsed by the military, but it was not the perception of the military which actually played a role. The most important role was played by the fact that the National Security Advisor and then the Defense Minister, Home Minister and others felt this was not the right time to go ahead with this. The reason being that there had been a terrorist attack before that, and that had, sort of colored the perceptions of decision makers at that time. So what came first is, you can keep going into this, what led to the change in the situation. Well, that's I'm not so sure that that's so useful. The fact is that, as I said, it is very important that the room for diplomacy needs to be maintained. As far as nuclear deterrence is concerned, again, I do not think it is useful to go into what role nuclear deterrence has played. I rather see it as it is a fact of life now. Both countries are nuclear weapon states. Both regard these weapons as being not weapons of use, hopefully, but weapons of deterrence. And in all this, it is, if you also ask American strategists or Chinese strategists or others, it is more a mind game rather than anything actually to do with the weapons. So it's perceptions about what the weapons do that really create the sense of deterrence. How do you see the role of the weapons? I think I can't speak about Pakistan, but certainly on the Indian side, we do not see these as weapons that can be used. We see that as weapons which deter the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons. So there is also a difference in that we do not see these as deterrence against a conventional threat. We see these as deterrence against the possible use of nuclear weapons. Once deterrence breaks, which is the point we always make, once deterrence breaks, then the consequences are totally unpredictable. Most likely, once that threshold is crossed, our sense is that it will go right up to the statistic exchange. That the very dynamic of the use of weapons is such that you cannot contain it at any particular threshold. Now, that may be wrong. Even Europe went through, graduated response, finally came to the conclusion there was no such thing as graduated response. So I do not think that applies in the case of whether it is in the nuclear standoff between India and Pakistan or India and China or any other situation. I do not think that works.
So as often is the case in panels that I run, we're running over time. So I want to ask for everyone to just give one final set of comments. They can be responses to past questions, but maybe we can start with Polly and just have final remarks before we move on to the next panel.
Yes, I just wanted to raise an issue that I had intended to raise earlier, and that is just a comment about what Michael, who's not here to make the comment himself, would call the U.S. policy playbook in response to South Asian crises. And that really comes back to what both of you have talked about, really rather benign diplomatic moves that are in any government's portfolio, getting on a plane and going to talk to leaders, counseling restraint, bringing in other people who have equities in preventing tensions from escalating. I think that these are precisely the sorts of international diplomacy the next panel will talk about. But I did want to clarify what I think Michael means by the U.S. playbook. It has followed the same pattern pretty much under every administration up until now. We'll see what happens next.
I don't know whether I have anything to add. On the playbook, let me say that yes, certainly I think it is always welcome to have friends who come and try to help resolve these kind of crises. But let me say this, that I think ultimately it is the main actors involved who have to decide that they do not wish to escalate the situation. In that respect, whatever may be the the nature of the relationship between India and Pakistan, my own sense is that leaders of both countries have actually proved to be reasonably sensible and sober people.
Yeah, I agree that basically it is the leadership, it is the formal settings which have to decide things, the governments. But all the other efforts are important. I just want to make one clarification regarding this question of nuclear weapons. That is that Pakistan does not contemplate use of nuclear weapons, limited or otherwise, unless its own territory is occupied. That would be a desperate situation. There, what do you do? So that is one scenario, and this is all thought experiment, mind game. So let's not go into the discussion of it. One should avoid
so
that.
I'm glad
and
that as on that.
as I have said, that these mind games should be played in order to see to develop wire trips, to develop how we can prevent that situation from happening. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think our work at the Stimson Center has focused a lot on recognizing that deterrence is a fact of life, but there are different doctrines and postures that can be more or less stable, more or less crisis prone, incur more or less risk. And obviously, we try to find ways in which we can both reduce risk, increase stability. So thank you very much to the panelists and the contributors to our edited volume. And I'll invite the second panel, Moeed, and come on up.
Thank you.
Okay.
So our second panel will be starting in just a minute.
Thank you, Paulie.
I'll ask you to...
Yeah, what is your program, Shyam?
Yeah, we can move those out there.
What's your program?
I have something on at 2:30 to 4 at Brookings. Between 4 and 6.
Yeah, we'll get them up here in a second. That's fine. That's fine. Yep. Just have opening comments. Good.
Are you still speaking, or are you done?
I'll make closing comments. I can just do it from a mic later. So, or I can turn it off right now. Yeah. Folks. Adele, how do we get a mic so I can actually ask people to take their seats for this panel?
Folks, is this working? Can I ask you all to take your seats? We have a second panel and a speaker who's calling in from Thailand to offer some comments. So we want to make sure we get her in this panel, and then we can move on with our discussions after.
Hey, hi, how are you? Come on down. Nice to meet you. Hannah, where did you want to sit?
I'll be down here.
Down here?
Yep.
All right, excellent. So I'll have you sit in this seat. Okay.
Rich, how are you?
How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Where am I?
You're on the end there, sir.
Here?
Yep.
We haven't met. Well, let's chat after this. I just want to make sure we get the second panel started.
You push that. And
Yeah.
I'll leave it muted for now. Okay. And I'll hold up a sign. Just in case it's still muted. You can put this in any pocket or clips on. The clip isn't the easiest thing to use. And your cell phone won't cause any interference. Okay. I'm going to turn this off.
How are you?
Good, man.
Okay?
Good. Yeah.
Sorry,
How
I
things?
haven't been able to.
I know.
join
We
you
need to
at
get
your-
you. We need to get you
at any
for
of your
sure.
things, but I would
we are
love
planning
to do that.
something mid-Feb on this whole U.S., Pakistan, India. You know, the blow up plus. So I'm gonna bother you again.
Okay.
Hopefully, one of these
just
times.
keep trying. My travel
No,
schedule has really been so relentless.
Absolutely.
In fact, back on the road again Saturday.
We
and
will
then,
keep pushing.
Okay.
We will keep pushing.
Must be an interesting time for you too. I mean, so much really negative happening.
It's interesting, but it's
depressing.
Yoon, are you on the line?
What are you supposed to do beyond the phone? Especially in the current environment, because quite frankly, one doesn't know who's listening. That's part of the problem.
I know.
I mean, who are you speaking to is
Yeah.
probably the biggest challenge right now.
Any pocket. So just so you know, let me show you something real quick. So that red line means you're muted, and you push that one.
Before speaking.
Yeah. And you can leave it on if you want now, or if you want to
No, my kids have been all the time. I'm like, if you don't mind speaking. No,
Unless it causes static for you.
no, you just get into it. And
Good,
realize
thanks.
What's the worst that can happen? Right.
There's a lot.
That's true. That's true.
Hey, Polly.
Fame,
How are you?
Yeah. So the difference now is
Good
like,
to see you.
yeah,
Storm out.
exactly.
Especially someone like you, I could have some high level person.
That's right.
I gotta sit, I'm done with Stimson.
That's right. What are you going to do? We're all trying to contribute some greater understanding here. We'll see.
Yeah, but this is a much smaller channel. This is my share.
Sure. It's a good turnout.
Well, I was going to say the people in the room are all, almost everyone in here. People who have been doing this for a while. They're excited about what we're talking about.
Good.
I will start as soon as I'm told to.
Ben, how are you? Good to see you.
Saying how little we talked about these subjects, you know, in government, and it's outside of government that you get to dive into them a lot more.
Part of the problem right now, I think, is the government, quote unquote, is in some ways deliberately cut off from all these conversations. It's just not happening. So,
We'll see.
already doing that. Tell Samir he's out of time. Gotta make up his mind. We're all set, Samir. So should I start or wait?
I think we should get started. Yep. We just gotta make the steps.
Okay.
I think if you start talking, people will come in.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
out of like
Okay, well,
pity, if nothing else.
Exactly.
Okay, am I on? Folks, I think we're gonna get started here. So I'll start talking, and then slowly we'll bring people
Is your
in
mic
if it's
on?
not on.
Anna, I don't think your mic is on.
It does say it's on.
You're on.
Oh, it is on.
I think I am on.
Yep. You're good to go.
Just not loud enough.
Oh, move it up just a little bit longer. That's fine. You want it to be like fist length underneath your chin. It's more for the live stream.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna get going. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, it's on.
Take it on.
Yeah?
Yeah.
We all right on sound?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for joining us today for our second panel on anticipating and thinking about third-party approaches to crises in South Asia. This discussion is meant to think about the threats and opportunities that potential new future crises could pose for U.S. interests and Chinese interests. We will focus on the United States and China, both with long histories in the region. For the United States, as many of us know, we've played a primary third-party crisis manager role, and China has historically played a fairly limited role, but we've seen an increasing trend line of involvement, and that's what the chapter that Yusuf and I have written addresses. All of this is unfolding as new actors in South Asia and the Indo-Pacific are interacting. So we have a rising China, we have the U.S. role in South Asia shifting. Simultaneously, we're seeing, on the one hand, a deepening in U.S.-India relations and a souring of U.S.-Pakistan relations. And on the other hand, we're seeing China developing its relationship with Pakistan and working, encountering some tension with India. So meanwhile, we have live fire occurring across the line of control. And what this means for our panel today is that we're looking at a new crisis landscape. So with that, I'm going to adjust this. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We are looking at three very distinguished people. The first is Ambassador Rich Verma, and we'll go through his bio in just a moment. The second is Moeed Yusuf from USIP. And the third is our panelist joining us over the phone, Yun-Sun, who's our resident China scholar. So I'll go ahead and introduce her very briefly, and then we're going to hear remarks from her. And Yun is unfortunately not going to be able to join us for the Q&A, so if you have questions for Yun, we will be happy to connect you with her at a later time or via email. So Yun is our senior associate with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. Her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. And she joined Stimson from the Brookings Institution. So Yun, if you can hear us, I'll ask you to go ahead and give us your remarks now.
Sure.
Yun, do we have you?
Well, thank you very much. Yeah,
Great.
I'm here. Thank you for having me. So thank you for
I was asked to discuss China's role in the crisis management in South Asia. And in the process of developing this chapter, it became a fascinating question on what role is China capable of playing, and at the same time, it's willing to play. And the answer to these questions are rather complicated. And it starts with China's perceived national interest and strategy in the South Asia region. So as a part of China's immediate periphery, the peace and stability of South Asia's subcontinent constitutes a key area for China's national interest. A potential crisis between India and Pakistan as two de facto nuclear states could have catastrophic implications for China's critical national interests. China pursues a delicate and balanced approach between India and Pakistan in the security crisis that involves conventional force. It advocates for dialogue, de-escalation of tensions, and the resumption of diplomatic negotiations between the two. So ostensibly, if we look from the surface, China's position is rather neutral. However, China's ostensibly neutral position on the tactical level does not negate or disguise a geostrategic instinct on Beijing's part to support Pakistan. China has pursued a balancing diplomacy between India and Pakistan, and this choice is based on several judgments regarding China's national interests regionally and globally. So fundamentally, China feels that it has to work with India due to India's size, India's influence, and the so-called developing country solidarity vis-a-vis the developed countries. China and India are the largest of two developing countries and emerging powers. China is interested in strengthening cooperation with India as a member, as both are members of the global South, vis-a-vis the developed countries on issues of common interest, such as energy, climate change, and the so-called international economic order. However, such an alignment on the global level does not undermine the fact that China is increasingly worried about India due to, one, the border dispute, and two, more importantly, a perceived Indian ambition to exclusive regional hegemony in South Asia. China sees India as the only regional power in South Asia with the potential capacity and ambition to compete with China for regional dominance. The U.S. support of India to counterbalance China's emerging regional leadership role further makes China believe that there is a shared aspiration and a shared plan between Washington and New Delhi to contain China in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean. In this sense, Pakistan, rather than India, is the cornerstone of China's South Asian policy. Regardless of its internal fragility, Pakistan remains China's main channel of check and balance against India. The belief in China is that as long as India is tied down to competition and confrontation with Pakistan as its primary national security threat, and to the Kashmir dispute as its primary national security priority, India would not be freed up to target China or to pursue its regional strategic ambitions. In this sense, given that a genuinely peaceful and stable relation between India and Pakistan is desirable but improbable, and given that China's long-term interest in terms of South Asia is not optimistic, China essentially sees the peace and stability in South Asia lies in a balance of power between India and Pakistan. The more unbalanced the equilibrium is against Pakistan, the more unstable South Asia will become in Beijing perception. And this perception is not only because, in China's view, India might exploit a weak position of Pakistan in the region to evaluate its own advantage, but also because that a weakened Pakistan is more likely to provoke India out of a sense of vulnerability and resort to foreign crises to divert the attention on its domestic problems. So this biased position fundamentally defines China's approach toward crisis management between India and Pakistan. Although China claims to be neutral in the crisis between the two countries, its strategic conflict with and long-term concern over India, along with its traditional alignment with and support of Pakistan, seriously undermines China's credibility as a neutral and honest broker in South Asia. Nevertheless, China has an innate interest in preventing a major conflict in South Asia that has the potential to evolve into a nuclear disaster. This interest promotes Beijing to resort to one, multilateral coordination, two, great power coordination with the United States, and three, bilateral engagement with both India and Pakistan to manage the crisis between the two. And this pattern has been established in the past several crises between India and Pakistan. So as many countries call for China to assume a more significant role in the crisis management in South Asia, the real question for China is, what role does China have both the capacity and the willingness to play? China's position in South Asia's security situation is not neutral. Although it pursues a balanced approach and genuine desire for peace and stability, Beijing's long-term vision is inevitably colored by its concern over India's regional ambition and the so-called anti-China utility of its strategic alignment with the United States. So without a neutral position, any role as a mediator or arbitrator of China between India and Pakistan seems unlikely because India will naturally and rightfully reject such a biased mediation. Nevertheless, given the high stakes at hand, the next question is whether an unneutral China can be objective. The Chinese record seems to suggest that such a possibility does exist. China in the past has used its levers using Pakistan's risky behavior. In fact, as of today, many Chinese officials and military officers are fully confident that without China's approval, Pakistan may push the envelope, but will not risk a major confrontation with India, especially one that involves nuclear weapons. If such major overstepping or a nuclear disaster does seem imminent, China will see the need for an overbearing intervention regarding Pakistan and assume more of a manager's role. It's just currently, China seems to be satisfied to play the role of a facilitator in the event of a conventional military security crisis and limit Beijing's role to facilitate dialogue. Last but not least, regarding the Americans' role in the security crisis in South Asia, China's attitude is more or less mixed. So on the one hand, China sees the U.S. as a primary manager of South Asia's security crisis, given America's vested interests with both India and Pakistan. But on the other hand, China essentially sees the U.S. position is also biased, but biased toward India. And the U.S. has consistently failed to accommodate Pakistan's concerns. So this perception by Beijing is further complicated by what China sees as a U.S. recalibration of policy in South Asia, as the U.S. moves further closer to India with the Indo-Pacific strategy. So for China, the the idea of an Indo-Pacific strategy is inevitably seen as another form of containment strategy on China. So in this sense, any effort by the United States to engage China in a South Asia security crisis will be affected by the Chinese skepticism on the purpose and consequences of such a policy coordination. So that's primarily the finding of our research for the chapter. Thank you very much for having me on this panel, and I look forward to exchanging views with the experts and the audience via email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yun. We really appreciate it. So next we have Ambassador Verma. Ambassador Verma was the U.S. Ambassador to India from 2014 to 2017, and he is the Vice Chairman and Partner at the Asia Group.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you. Let me congratulate the Stimson Center, first of all, for taking this subject on in such a really forthright way. I will tell you, these are hot topics. These are difficult subjects. As I was saying to my fellow panelists, I've probably talked more about these subjects after leaving government than while I was in government, which is too bad. But I really do appreciate your perseverance in the scholarship, because it's exactly what's needed, because in government we have so many constraints and especially talking about these subjects publicly. I'm not sure this is a panel I would have spoken at a year ago, but I'm really delighted to be here today, and I think your work really adds a lot. I also am really honored to be here with such a distinguished group of panelists, including the prior panel, the two former foreign secretaries and Ambassador Saran, who has really helped me understand the complexities in South Asia, and he's been a good friend and mentor. I'll just say, during my tenure as ambassador, we saw the full range of ups and downs in the relationship between India and Pakistan. There were the positives, the announcement of the resumption of the comprehensive dialogue. There was Prime Minister Modi's Christmas Day surprise visit to Lahore. And of course, there were the negatives, the Pathankot and Uri attacks, the uptick in cross-border tensions, and the collapse of the never-begun talks. Now, these certainly felt like crises at the time for me, though according to your report, which I have read from cover to cover, and I congratulate you, they may not fully qualify as crises. Now, regardless of how one might classify the incidents or the difficult state of India-Pakistan relations today, there remains a real risk of escalation, a risk of miscalculation, a risk of mistaking signals from the other side. And unfortunately, these are the risks that have been present for decades. Your report rightfully captures also the changing geopolitical dynamics at play across the region today, and Hannah mentioned them. India and China have faced renewed tensions, as evidenced by last summer's 71-day dangerous standoff at the Doklam Plateau. The U.S. and Pakistan have seen a steady downturn in relations, while the U.S. and India have been on an upward trajectory, and that continues with the Trump administration. These shifting dynamics, not to mention the fragility of the situation in Afghanistan, call into question whether the crisis management playbook used in prior India-Pakistan crises still holds up. It also raises several key questions. What is the role of the United States, and for that matter, China, as the previous speaker just covered? Are there greater chances of escalation today, or has the potential for escalation subsided due to increased deterrence, increased intelligence, and each party's reluctance to become embroiled in something intractable? From a U.S. point of view, I think there is no question that South Asia is growing ever more consequential. And there's no doubt this has in some measure been driven by the rise of India, a country that in 12 years will be the most populous, will have the third largest economy, the third largest military, with the world's largest middle class and number of college graduates, a nation that has been growing into its global role following years of inward-facing foreign policies and a closed economic posture. Today, it is the world's fastest-growing economy, experiencing mass urbanization, with tens of millions of people being lifted out of poverty each year. I was honored to play my small part in the U.S.-India story. In the closing 3 years of the Obama administration, President Obama and Prime Minister Modi met an unprecedented 9 times. They negotiated the Paris Climate Agreement together. India was designated a major defense partner. Defense sales topped $15 billion. Some 100 new initiatives and 40 government-to-government dialogues were launched, and new agreements on intelligence, defense logistics, cybersecurity, and homeland defense were sealed. But on the question of India-Pakistan, outside of actual crises, our range of activity and commentary, like prior administrations, was actually quite limited. We called for dialogue and de-escalation at times of heightened tension. We offered up the help of law enforcement, the FBI, and intelligence agencies following the major cross-border incidents, and we formally condemned cross-border terror when it occurred, reducing any perceived distance between D.C. and Delhi. But on the broader questions of normalization between India and Pakistan, or how and when Kashmir could be settled, we stuck to the script. a tried and tested script that goes something like this. We support de-escalation and dialogue between India and Pakistan, but the pace, scope, and character of those discussions are to be decided by the parties. Pace, scope, and character. That lexicon has become so embedded and reflexively used by U.S. officials for years. I said it so much that when I once said those 3 words out of order, I got an immediate call from an Indian reporter asking if there had been a change in U.S. policy. I was even worried that if questions came up about India and Pakistani cricket teams, that I would have to resort to pace, scope, and character. But what started to happen was that all questions related to India and Pakistan, not just Kashmir, got thrown into this pace, scope, and character construct. Should there be increased transit trade between the 2 countries? Should there be more humanitarian visas issued? What about detained fishermen? Why does Pakistan allow a different list of goods to be imported from India by sea than by land? All worthy questions for which we might have had something to say, only to punt to the pace, scope, and character frame. We can do better. As the world's remaining superpower, we have to do better. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that the United States try to intervene in settling long-standing disputes between the 2 countries. There is no appetite for that on the Indian side. Internationalization is not in the party's interest. And frankly, so long as extremist groups can continue to use Pakistan as a base for conducting cross-border strikes, the space for dialogue has become even more constrained. As the Indian External Affairs Minister rightly said, terror and talks do not go together. But what I am suggesting is that we can be prepared not only for the next crisis, but we should continuously be looking at those paths of escalation, identify what they are, and determine how we can best shut them down. Strobe Talbot used to lament that South Asia was important, but few senior leaders in the administration focused on it until it was urgent. We don't have that luxury today. South Asia is too important to wait until there is a dire situation. So let me offer a few ideas on this front. First, let me say that personal relationships matter. They matter in peacetime and even more when a crisis confronts a nation and its people. And those relationships cannot be developed, and trust cannot be instilled after the crisis hits. That's why it's critical for Washington to continue to build trusted relationships in Delhi and Islamabad. It's why we had the 40-plus dialogues and regular conversations by the national security advisors, the foreign secretaries, and heads of state. It's why we set up a hotline between President Obama and Prime Minister Moeed so they could talk, confer, and strategize as needed. The patterns of working together, the friendships, and the reservoir of trust must be built over time. Second, the United States should continue to use its influence, waning though it may be during this challenging time, to convince the Pakistani military and intelligence services to rein in those terror groups operating from within its borders. As my friend Ashley Tellis says as in his compelling essay, wondering whether India and Pakistan talks are, quote, worth a damn, he says the following, quote, there is a role for the U.S. in encouraging a peace settlement between India and Pakistan, but the approach must be subtle and focused on pressing Rawalpindi to end state-sponsored terrorism targeted against India, an instrument that has acquired renewed vitality ever since Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons in the 1990s, end quote. And Michael Crapon writes in your report released today, which has been mentioned in the earlier panel, quote, because the spark for every crisis since Operation Brass Tacks has come from within Pakistan, the burden of crisis avoidance falls primarily upon Rawalpindi. We should channel our energies, therefore, in pressing Pakistan to end its state support for these groups. At the same time, we should continue to ramp up our information and intelligence sharing to ensure that groups planning attacks cannot gain an advantage. As Michael further indicated in the report, deeper intelligence cooperation between the U.S. and India would be unsettling for Pakistan, but it could also have some useful deterrent effects in preventing crisis-triggering explosions. Third, and finally, we could and should be supporting more confidence-building measures and institutionalized and regularized patterns of communication. Two nations can be highly estranged, but still maintain an active dialogue. The active dialogue, whether it be through field commanders, NSAs, foreign secretaries, or trade officials, can help diffuse the next crisis. In this regard, and it was mentioned in the previous panel, compare the frequency and regularity of the dialogue between India and China versus India and Pakistan, with the former being much more comprehensive than the latter. And as Ambassador Saran mentioned, when the Doklam standoff hit last year, neither side wanted to become embroiled in a costly and dangerous conflict, and the avenues for communication were alive and active, and it made a difference. The same cannot be said for the Pathankot or Uri attacks, where communications were difficult and irregular. Without the clear lines of communications, the signaling can be badly misinterpreted, leading to even greater risks. Obviously, the U.S. can only do what the parties actually want in this regard. But there may be track 2 or track 1.5 dialogues, conversations on trade, regional efforts to combat climate change, or solving pressing health challenges that bring the parties together in a more regularized way. Let me say in closing that the overriding interest in South Asia is for people to live in peace, free from terror, with free and open systems of government that allow them to prosper, be educated, and to excel in this very complicated but promising time. The individual relationships the U.S. has with both India and Pakistan are exceptionally important, and they stand on their own, with the hyphens gone and counterbalancing a thing of the past. The U.S. continues to have important influence, and we are entering a transformative period, and I know our role is not limited to one of just managing crises. Indeed, the potential for our partnership together across South Asia is what gives me great hope for the future days ahead. Advanced research and discussions like these can help ensure that the potential for significant security disruptions are greatly minimized. Again, I want to thank Stimson and all the panelists for the important contribution they've made to peace and security across the subcontinent.
Thank you. Moeed, you're up next. Let me briefly introduce you and your new book. Moeed Yusuf is the Associate Vice President of the Asia Center at the United States Institute of Peace, and he has a new book coming out from Stanford, Brokered Bargaining in Nuclear Environments, U.S. Crisis Management in South Asia, and it looks at third-party involvement in nuclear-tinged crises. And that's coming out in March?
April.
April, so
thanks for the information. Good morning, everyone. So thanks to Stimson, Michael, Samir, Hannah for giving me this opportunity. And what I thought I'll do as a non-contributor to the volume, but somebody who's sort of been eating, living, and breathing crises for the past 3 years as I was doing my book, is to tie some of what I saw in your very, very impressive volume to some of my findings that are forthcoming in the book. But let me just begin by saying that there is a real value addition in this volume. I'm focused on the third-party sort of angle of that for obvious reasons, but it's surprising how little has been written about China's role, given how important China is. So I want to congratulate you on sort of your focus on that area. And then, of course, Michael's work in his chapter or chapters brings out his 2-decade-long experience with this work very clearly, and some original thoughts there, including the risks that we may face in future crises that may or may not be different than previous crises. But in the spirit of being provocative, let me make 4 or 5 points and see if I could spark an interesting discussion on this. One, I would argue, and a lot of this is in your volume, South Asian crisis moments I find as particular instances in time when normal diplomacy is suspended. And this is not only because there's a crisis, but I think we tend to make too much of conventional alliance structures, geostrategic implications of who sides with who at a particular moment. What I have found is that during these crises moments, and particularly because they are nuclear tinged, as you call it, I wish I could steal this term from my book, it's too late. But the normal alliance considerations tend to get suspended for those 2 weeks or 6 months or 10 months, and then all countries seem to revert to those as soon as the crisis is over. And so the idea that, India, US versus China, Pakistan, I think that's the direction the world is headed in South Asia. But in crisis moments, I'd be careful in taking that too far, as if these countries would forget that they're dealing with a potential nuclear escalation. I found in my work very interestingly, and this would surprise many, but those in government may sort of bail me out, the issue of Afghanistan was almost never discussed in meetings of principals about the India-Pakistan crisis going on at the time, which is very different than what we seem to think. At the working level, people were obsessed with Afghanistan and US equities in the process, but actually at the principals level who were driving the crisis policy, there wasn't much mention. In fact, in the Mumbai crisis, the Afghanistan-Iraq sort of directorate that was looking at Afghanistan and Iraq at the NSC was not even involved in sort of the principals' conversations. And as one of the US crisis managers put it to me, the goal of the US at that particular moment in time becomes de-escalation, de-escalation, de-escalation. And then, everything else follows from that. That's one. Second, I think absolutely correctly your volume points out that China's role is changing. It's becoming larger. Especially in the last year, we are seeing a very different China per force, perhaps, given how the geostrategic environment is playing out. The only 2 points I would make there, one is in continuation of my last one, which is that I am not entirely sure alliance structures are as clear yet as many have made it out to be. I think global alliances are in flux, and much more likely than a clear-cut China, Pakistan, India, US, you will see an issue-based alliance structure. I don't see India and the US partnering on Iran, for instance, beyond a point, depending on how the crisis plays out and if there's a larger role there. I quite frankly also do not see either the US ganging up with India or China with Pakistan in a crisis where nuclear weapons are involved. And I think the past bears that out, and I don't think that trend is going to change that easily. Which brings me to a crucial policy point, which is that the US and China, while they spend time at figuring out how they are going to be competitors in the new world age, also need to spend a lot of time in figuring out how they may need to or are forced to or should collaborate in third-party crisis management in South Asia, but quite frankly, North Korea is a great example right now. Whichever way you come at it, ultimately there's a Beijing-Washington conversation needed on it. And if the US-China communication is broken during crises, I think that to me is more dangerous than worrying about irresponsible Indian and Pakistani leaders who quite frankly have not been irresponsible in crises as far as I've found in my work. A word about bilateral escalation control. That's the universal sort of golden benchmark for India, Pakistan, and everybody else. Michael talks about it. I mean, the volume, everything that one has read talks about this. I would argue that this urge comes from lessons from the Cold War, where there was positive learning after the first 15 or 20 years, and the last 2.5 decades of the Cold War, all sorts of confidence building, risk reduction measures came in. Today's world is different in one way. And again, I'm thinking of the theme of the panel. India and Pakistan and other countries have the option of transferring some of the burden of crisis management to willing third parties. And the important point to make here is that third parties in nuclear environments, third parties like the US, have agency. It's not that somebody asks them to show up to de-escalate. They are there on day one. In Kargil, it took them 2 weeks. In the 01-02 crisis, it was before India mobilized, which was 3 days, 4 days after the attack on the parliament. And in Mumbai, they were there before the attacks were over. Not because anybody called the US in, but it's that nuclear aspect that drives this behavior. Now, of course, India and Pakistan can decide whether they want the US and China and others involved or not. But I would argue that there is a serious disincentive for both countries to completely ignore the third party in such a scenario for 2 reasons. One, you almost force the hand of the third party to go closer to your opponent. And second, all simulations and all sort of fire drills that I've looked at, and Ambassador Saran talked about the strategic, going to the strategic once escalation happens, there is not a clear sense on how to stop once you start. And so that incentive is pretty serious to bring in, and I'm not talking of outside intervention for dispute resolution. This is very much a crisis phenomena, as far as I can tell. So to me, it's not a question of whether the US and China and others will show up. The question is what will they do and what they're able to do when they show up. And there I think the volume makes a very good point about the current environment being unprecedented in some ways, because the unpredictability of what the US may do or the US crisis managers may do makes everybody nervous, including perhaps the crisis actors themselves. So we'll have to wait and see where that goes. Fourth, one point of disagreement perhaps with what I read in the volume. I don't think credibility and trust of the third party is as important as influence and leverage. Yes, of course, credibility and trust would be great. But if you look at the past crises since Kargil, there was never a moment when both India and Pakistan trusted the US. It was about an incentive to de-escalate, which was shared by India, Pakistan, and the third party, and leverage that the US could bring to the table for various reasons. If the US cannot bring as much, can China bring more? I mean, these are questions that we'll have to debate going forward. And that's why the coordination between these 3 parties is crucial. There's a lot of conversation about the next crisis and escalation. Again, I would agree with the speakers in the first panel that upping the ante is a very dangerous game, because de-escalation becomes more and more difficult as you ride the escalation ladder. I personally would argue that India and Pakistan have actually been fairly careful in how they have approached this escalation ladder. That said, there have been multiple risks involved in each crisis that could have inadvertently led to escalation that they did not want. So that question, of course, remains open. Let me just make 2 more points, because I know Hannah's phone is working overtime, probably on stopwatch. One, I think this point about intelligence sharing is crucial, and intelligence capacity before intelligence sharing. The US involvement in that, I think the Chinese cannot come close. No other country can come close, even though you need to pool resources. And there I would argue the US intelligence cooperation is not about US-India intelligence cooperation. It is about US-India-Pakistan intelligence cooperation for 3 things as far as crises are concerned. 1, real-time information to prevent crises. Second, attribution of crisis triggers, if possible. And third, crisis management if we are in the middle of a crisis. The attribution point is crucial, because there is now a tendency on both sides to blame the other as soon as something happens. And where I would perhaps differ slightly with you, Rich, is terror and talk is a very difficult parallel track to follow for India. Terror should disappear from the face of this earth. It's not going to. And thus, unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, terror and talks have to go together. Because think about this from the non-state actor's perspective or the terrorist perspective. You know, we talk about sort of the LETs of the world, etc. Put a scenario in front of you, and by the way, Skandar's chapter in this was fairly imaginative in what could happen. But put a scenario in front of you where there is a genuine ISIS attack that brings India and Pakistan to the verge of a crisis. If the argument is there can be no conversation after a terrorist attack, then ISIS has got it made, because that's exactly the situation they want. So I would argue, as difficult as it is, cutting off dialogue is simply no answer. And one related thing that I would say here is that we need to be a bit careful about unknowingly creating perverse incentives for either India or Pakistan on various things. So anytime a crisis occurs and the provoker essentially gets away unscathed, you've just created a moral hazard problem next time. The incentive to go back is higher. On the other hand, to argue that, which Michael does correctly, that all crises have had a trigger coming from Pakistan, actually creates a very serious perverse incentive for Pakistan. Because if I were looking at it from the Pakistani perspective, I would make a simple argument that my mistake was that after the Samjhota train attacks in which the Pakistani citizens were killed in India, I should have actually escalated and created a crisis so that Michael couldn't say that. I actually think it's more responsible that they didn't create a crisis at that time. Otherwise, one crisis would have been created because of India. So I think we need to be careful about these incentive structures. And the argument I would make is essentially don't escalate. And if we can get the attribution right, there are ways that we can blame and punish provokers after the crisis rather than escalating or after we have avoided crisis. Final point, and the most important point I think in your volume, and it's the same in my book. There is no possible way, realistically, of preventing crises unless larger underlying issues remain. And I'm not talking about only disputes, I'm talking about everything. And what I have picked up from crisis management is that crisis management, because of the de-escalation fixation, thankfully, becomes so tactical that it's only about getting past the crisis moment. So the third parties would make promises to both sides. They will try and convince the other that if you bank on me, I will get you what you want. Of course, if US is promising both India and Pakistan that, by definition, there's a contradiction, because they can't give both what they want. But as soon as the crisis is over, if you look at the post-crisis period, both sides walk away dissatisfied and promising never to rely on the US again, which makes crisis management more difficult in the next iteration and the next iteration. And so ultimately, there is no way around a serious dispute resolution, including everything that matters to both sides. I am not talking of a grand bargain. I completely agree with Ambassador Saran. It's not going to come overnight. But I would want to end on an optimistic note, and I'm probably naive in this, and I acknowledge that. India and Pakistan is a very interesting rivalry where solutions to virtually all their major problems is known and worked out by both sides themselves. I mean, we can tinker with where Siachen goes and where the ultimate line is drawn and whether Kashmir is a 4-point or a 6-point or an 8-point. But I think the contours are known. And if we could go there when Ambassador Saran and Riaz Mohammed Khan were sitting and dealing with this, I see no reason these sides cannot go back to that again. Yes, there are problems, there are all sorts of issues. But to say that we will manage crisis after crisis without figuring out a more sustainable path for India-Pakistan, I think is basically waiting for a disaster to happen. Let me stop there. Was that optimistic? I got it. Sorry.
I think so. Thank you both. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask the first question here, and then I also want to encourage you to respond to one another if you'd like to, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. So my question is, how do you anticipate the Trump administration would approach a new India-Pakistan crisis? And in that, do you see U.S. incentives having shifted for being the main third-party crisis manager?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think this skill set of being able to predict what the Trump administration might do on any given day is an evolving skill set for many of us. So, look, the there are some differences, and I think one of the issues raised in the book is in this era of America first, more inward-looking, more nationalistic views, some degree of retrenchment. Does this administration still view itself as a crisis manager? Or do they view that as something someone else should do? Someone asked me to explain Trump foreign policy today, and I said, look, I think it's better for you to draw a line from like Pittsburgh through northwestern Ohio into Michigan and Wisconsin and see how these issues play on that spectrum, as opposed to whether we're going to resort to our longstanding kind of view as a global leader. So I think that's an open question. Are we still viewed as the superpower that can intervene and play a definitive role? I have a strongly held view that we have to, we should, we are kind of that player, taking into account Ambassador Saran's very important qualification that it really will be up to the parties at the time. But I think what we're referring to is an actual crisis that had been escalated. But I think the Trump administration is still trying to figure out its worldview on that question. I also think the way in which the downturn in U.S.-Pakistan relations has occurred, the very public way, the tweets, the kind of naming and shaming approach, I think there's some real question now about the influence that the United States might have in trying to rein in Pakistan. I will remember, and Ambassador, this may have been when you were Foreign Secretary, when Prime Minister Singh came to the U.S. in the mid-2000s, and I was working in the Senate then, in the Senate Leader's Office, and he came in and gave a briefing to assembled members of the Senate, and the first thing he said was, you need to get your relationship with Pakistan in order. And it really surprised everyone sitting around the table, because he said what we didn't want was a complete falling out between the United States and Pakistan. And so I think we have to be careful here because of this potential for the administration's influence in this part of the world to decline.
Fortunately, I left my crystal ball back at USIP, but you know, I tend to come at this more from a structural perspective. I mean, everything I've looked at tells me that in the inter-crisis period, if you will, there are all these concerns. Whether the US will show up, whether Pakistan and India will want to have a conversation or not. You know, the idea of India will first act now and then see where we want to go. All of that, I think we have to take into account. I think there is no guarantee that the US plays the role that it played in the past. But I think the structural drivers of the nuclear environment, the fact that escalation is a real danger, the fact that India, Pakistan do not want escalation and do not have good bilateral escalation control mechanisms, and the fact that, quite frankly, every single interview I conducted for my book in the US, this is from working level right to the very top, dozens, I didn't get a single person telling me that they would have a second thought in terms of going and doing whatever they could. So I think the question of the US showing up is definitely, to me, a predetermined one. How it will play out is going to be a very interesting question to ask, because when a US crisis manager gets on the phone, it's crucial in terms of what messages they deliver. And there I think you really do need a crystal ball right now.
All right, thank you. So with that, we'll open up the floor. I think Samir has already established ground rules. Please introduce yourself, pose your question in the form of a question, and limit it to 30 seconds. And we'll do 3 at a time. So, sir, please.
Hi, I'm Donald Camp, currently with CSIS. I'm intrigued by the discussion of China as a contributor to the coordination process, the crisis management. When I was more involved with policy planning in the U.S., we knew we could depend on our allies, and what Polly calls the U.S. game plan the American Secretary of State would land in Delhi. We knew that the British Foreign Secretary would follow when he left, and then the French Foreign Minister. But dealing with China was much more difficult. We wanted their participation, but they were kind of opaque. And our coordination with China involved usually going to Beijing and telling them what we were doing. They were playing a role, but we never were quite sure what it was. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of current policymakers and others, whether China, as it's embraced a more active role in global governance, has become more transparent with us. I'll ask Rich, did you have the kind of relationship with your counterpart in Delhi that would allow that kind of coordination? And Moeed, I mean, do you see that in your
Sure.
Book research?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is Ahmed Khan, visiting fellow in Atlantic Council. If we go through the literature of Cold War, we see that U.S. Played a core state and supplied arms to its periphery states to fuel the belligerence and hostility in its periphery states. And we see supply of arms to Pakistan and other states to fight against communism. So if in this session I learned that China can play a similar kind of role, but I am able to see what is the rule of engagement of Chinese management in South Asia. Will it be a supply of arms to Pakistan? And how can China able to manage, or what could be the rules of engagement between China, India and Pakistan in a crisis situation? Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Yes, sorry.
Hi, I'm James Schmeling. I want to ask about surgical strikes. Last year, a slightly different question than what we've just heard. After Uri, there was a period of waiting, where a cooling off period after the crisis, and then the Indians went across the line of control. Having been in Beijing recently, and in light of the Doklam crisis, they were thinking anew about how to interpret Indian cross-border activity east and west over the past 2 years. But what do you make of changing Indian military capability and will, and what that means for future crisis management?
Thank you. So you guys
On China, I think, Don, the point is well taken. As it was explained to me, was that we coordinate with allies and we keep China informed. And I think it's pretty much there still. I don't think it's a function of China becoming, a more important player, as much as it is that at the strategic level, the US and China were doing the same things, right from Kargil through. And I think Michael uses this term in or I think it's Polly's work, shoulder to shoulder with the US. That doesn't mean tactically they were doing the same thing. So in Mumbai, for instance, China and Pakistan were having conversations about Chinese supplying Pakistan, urgently supplying military spares, which were needed, right? And the Chinese would go along with that. But at the strategic level, they wanted this de-escalation to happen immediately. So I think it's pretty much, I see more of the same. I don't see it going beyond that in terms of US-China. China, India, Pakistan, the modality, I think essentially is counseling restraint. That's the fundamental message that goes. It's through shuttle diplomacy that's happened in the past. It's through other third parties. For instance, in Kargil, the Saudis were involved to some extent, trying to do certain things. Similarly, in Mumbai as well. So you're using different parties, not only China, but the question really is, if the US role diminishes, who fills the vacuum? That's sort of what's worrying everybody right now. And I would argue, one, the US role may diminish, but it won't be a vacuum in the crisis moment. Overall, it may well be. And the Chinese impulse has always been to find a way to force India, or to push Pakistan and India to de-escalate. That will remain. Whether they have still the backing, standing behind the US or looking at different ways, I think depends on how the primary third party, which is the US, acts. James, the surgical strike, I look at this quite closely for obvious reasons. One, I actually do not think it's much different than what had happened in the past many, many times. The difference was a political decision to own up to it and argue that we are doing this to signal to Pakistan. You can see what's happening here. If India basically sits back after a provocation, subconventional provocation, the credibility of the deterrent is non-existent. That's been the case since 98. That's been India's problem. On the flip side, though, I think I would argue India was very, very careful in making sure that there was no path to escalation after the surgical strikes. The danger here, of course, is that the other side may react in ways that you don't expect them to react, right? So I don't see this as a paradigm change in the way that India wants a limited conflict, and then it will see how to de-escalate. I actually think this was as much a domestic as it was an international action by India. But what is really happening here is that the impulse to prevent escalation is still as strong. Both sides are just trying to find out if the line can move slightly so that they can be more comfortable in signaling internationally and domestically. So the chances of a miscalculation are higher. But I actually do not see this as a paradigm shift, because you've got to keep in mind, as an Indian and Pakistani decision maker, you escalate, something happens, for whatever reason, Pakistan responds, tit for tat starts. Where do you go from there? You still have to look around to find a way to de-escalate. And that is a much tougher proposition for both sides than to do it at a lower level.
Yeah, I don't know. I have much to add to really excellent responses there. I would say, from what I've seen in the region and my own experience, is that China does not necessarily have the kind of muscle memory of coming in and playing this role as crisis manager. I think what's also true, though, is that they don't want a simmering or kind of conflict to erupt in the subcontinent. I think that's true as well. I actually think they would look to U.S. leadership in this regard. Yeah. And their kind of influence with Pakistan will be critical, as the book lays out. On the surgical strikes, I would say, look, we talk about India as a global power, rising power, however you want to define it, but I think this is, I guess I viewed it slightly differently. I think it is an indicator of a country that is asserting its right to self-defense more prominently and more pronounced for the, it may be signaling not only to Pakistan but to the international community. Right. And we, frankly, from a United States perspective, we would do the same thing. I can't imagine a situation where we would sit back and accept that kind of cross-border attack. All the same concerns about escalation are exactly right, but I think it sent a pretty powerful signal. Whether they've done this sort of thing in the past, the fact that they were more pronounced about it, I think, was actually an important change in how we view India's posture.
Not to become too academic about it, but I think the slight distinction in my mind is India did not exercise the right to self-defense. It signaled its intent to exercise its right to self-defense. So it did not think that just by doing this, the problem would disappear. But it signaled that it won't just sit back and keep letting this happen over and over again without something.
All right, we are out of time, so we can do a couple final questions. Yes, ma'am.
So over the past few years, India has grown closer to United States, and do you think the U.S. administration's present attitude towards Pakistan, do you think India has any influence on that, or India has influenced U.S.?
Thank you. Thank you. Any other final questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Joe Goldberg, formerly of the National Defense University. I wanted to ask whether or not the Chinese initiatives, which are involved with their Belt and Road programs, are part and parcel of an attempt of China not only to assert new influence not only in South Asia but throughout the area, is also coupled with an attempt to displace what would we describe as the structure of international security that was established after the Second World War, which we played a great role in. And if so, if this attack upon the traditional avenues that we know, even international organizations as such, takes place, to what extent will that play a significant role in altering our perception of strategic concerns.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Two good questions. I think.
Can I bring one more?
One
in?
more? Oh, sure.
Just because we have another distinguished guest here.
Sorry.
Don't leave Marvin out.
Yeah, we gotta get him in. You'll like his
Marvin Weinbaum, Middle East Institute. You know, in 2002, when Richard Armitage went out, at that point in time, we had reasonable trust in both Delhi and Islamabad. And then there was the personality factor here. He was a consummate diplomat when it came to understanding what it was going to take for both sides. How important does this personal element, but let me also add to that the obvious question, would there today, leaving whether the playbook could work that he used, have we gone too far now at this point where any American diplomat can win the trust of both sides?
Thank you. All right.
Okay, so look, I think, we've said this many times, and I believe it, and I'll say it again, that I think the relationships with India and Pakistan have evolved separately, stand on their own merit, have their own kind of complexities to them, and I don't believe that because we've had this upturn with a relationship with India, that somehow we have to have a corresponding downturn in our relations with Pakistan, or that somehow India has influenced Washington to take a downturn with Pakistan. I just don't believe that's the way it works, and there's too many people of good faith in all three capitals that are really trying to make the relationships work. There's no question the India relationship has evolved in kind of leaps and bounds, probably in a way that people did not predict, and I think we're trying to understand the ramifications of that, no question about it. On One Belt, One Road, and there's a lot of experts in here on One Belt, One Road. Look, I don't view it as a Chinese attempt to replace traditional architecture. In a way, I view it as Chinese attempts to exert influence, clear and simple, across the region and broader than that. And I think it has, some interesting elements of investment, but it has some really challenging elements to it, going through disputed territory, coming up with their method of financing being particularly difficult, and not playing by the international rules in the post-war system. So I think the fact that we haven't had a counter to One Belt, One Road is something serious and something that I hope we have another session to talk about one day, because I think it's really important. The reason I mentioned in my remarks about the trusted relationships is I do think the personal element of diplomacy really, really matters a lot. This is not a region where you can just show up and say, we're from the United States, therefore listen to us, especially now. I think it takes time, it takes repeated conversations. And Prime Minister Moeed said something interesting when he came to Washington in the summer of 2016 and addressed the joint session of Congress. He said, "We have overcome the hesitations of history between our two countries." Now, I think he's right, but I don't think everyone in India, for example, believes we've overcome those hesitations. And therefore, you have to work even harder at building those trusted relationships, because our history of not being a reliable partner, of taking contrary to positions to India's ascendancy, still hang out there in the ether, and we've got to overcome that. And the only way to overcome that is through the hard work of personal diplomacy.
Thanks again. Good questions. On the India influence, I have no evidence to suggest that somebody from India or the Indian government went and told the US to do this. In fact, some within the US government probably were a bit surprised. That said, I think the larger piece of the India-Pakistan puzzle, of course, affects everything that the US does with both countries. And the real problem here, I think, in terms of your question, is not that India went and said something or Pakistan went. The issue is that US has a very immediate concern or tension or divergence with Pakistan over Afghanistan. And the whole US-Pakistan narrative is consumed by that one issue. So the larger piece of the US-Pakistan relationship is held in abeyance till we figure that out. And unfortunately, that piece, to my mind, we cannot figure out because the divergence is real. So because that focus remains on that one very issue, I think you're bound to have the spillover on other issues that Pakistan is involved in. And I've been a big critic of focusing on Pakistan with that one particular lens, but that's the reality and it's not going to go away. So I think we need to just keep that in mind. On CPEC, I wonder who is doing more to challenge the institutions that were created after the Second World War right now. I think things are in such flux that in some cases, US policy may be opening that space. In other cases, the Chinese are pushing. The Russians are, of course, researching. But at the end of the day, I do not actually see still any signs of a balancing coalition which is standing up against the US to challenge the international liberal order. I mean, the Chinese gain more from it than any other country in the world. So yes, I think they will exert more influence. They are becoming more strategic. But I do not see this system disappearing in a way that South Asian crises would completely change character, anytime soon at least. On the question of personal, this is a very important one. And we can go back, and this is not the forum to the international relations, political science debate on the levels of analysis. Do leaders matter? Is it states operating in a certain way or structure? I think relationships matter. There's absolutely no question about that. If I don't like you, I'm going to take 2 meetings before I get to talk to you, and in a crisis situation, that may be too many. No question about that. That said, I do not see evidence in these kind of moments that interlocutors cannot overcome this problem, or that countries can't find interlocutors who have that channel open. I mean, if you think of 01, 02, you mentioned the 2001 and Armitage. I talked to Armitage and interviewed him for my work, and one of the things he told me interestingly was, I didn't get along with Musharraf at all. It took me a while to start trusting him, right? So when the crisis started, 9/11, I mean, you were in government at the time, you know how this played out. So I think it's very important, but not the ultimate deciding factor in terms of how it plays out. I will say one thing though. One of the points so one of my findings at least is that if you get into a situation where there are crises in nuclear environments and one of the countries is completely cut off from the third-party interlocutor, we're in trouble. So in North Korea that has no connection with the US or China is a much more dangerous crisis than whatever relationship one may have in which you can go back. So if the US-Pakistan relationship gets to a point where they're literally broken off and there is no conversation, then I think there is a serious problem, because the Chinese neither have the muscle memory nor the clout, quite frankly. And if the US cannot go to Islamabad in that situation, then I think we're in trouble. And for the crisis reason, I would say that those channels are crucial.
Great. Thank you both so much. We really appreciate it. I'm going to ask Samir to come up and close us.
Before you all run away, I just wanted to say a few quick things. So thank you all to the panelists for joining us today and lending your insights, your wisdom, and your time. To Shyam, Riaz, Polly, Rich, Moeed. This is fantastic. And thanks to you all for attending and bearing with us during some sort of technical challenges. I hope you all were able to hear some of Yunsun's comments during the discussion, but we will be also producing a transcript, so you'll be able to review that later. I thought a lot of her insights about the increasing role of China's stakes and likelihood to get involved and to at least preempt some escalation is quite important. And I'll also we'll ask her to maybe pen some responses to the questions that were posed about China that we can include with the transcript so that you can have access to some of those thoughts. Lastly, to thank our team, our staff who sort of made this event and the book and the last 2 years of efforts on this possible. Travis Wheeler, Akriti Vasudeva, Hamza Shad, Emily, Balint, Isla, thank you for supporting this entire venture. And then the last thank you goes to one of our fearless leader, Michael Crapon, who co-founded the Stimson Center, has set the course for this program for the last 25 years, seeded the idea of this book, and then has been a constant source of guidance and wisdom to me, and I think to all of us here at the Stimson Center. So for all those Thank you very much, and a round of applause again to our fantastic panelists.
Thanks. That was good. That was good.